Hey, hello, welcome to this presentation about web APIs and Power Query. Nowadays, a lot of data is in the cloud, like SalesForce or Dynamics, CRM. And if you want to connect to it and use the data in Power BI, you need to connect to Web API. In this presentation, I'll show you exactly how to do this. What does it mean to call a REST API? What is the JSON format? What is OData? How do you authenticate using OAuth or API keys? And especially also, how do you do the pagination? Because a lot of times you cannot get all the data at once. You have to get them piece by piece. Who am I? My name is Arthur Kraus, Power BI and Fabric trainer, developer. I give a lot of trainings about Power BI and Fabric. I used to be also a developer. In C#, I created web APIs and also connected to these web APIs from mobile apps and web development websites. So I know exactly what it is, this web API thing, and how to connect to it. And the last years I connect to dozens of web APIs from Power BI. So let me be your guide. If you have any questions, please reach out to me via email or LinkedIn. And I also have a blog, fabricco.com, where I post a lot of content about coding, Fabric, Power Query, Power BI, all these things. Okay, let's dive right into it. Let's take a look at web APIs. API stands for Application Programmers Interface, and is actually something that is meant for application programmers. People building apps, mobile apps, websites, and they want to connect to web API to insert, update, delete, or select some data. But it's actually not really meant for Power BI scenarios where you want to get all the data from a database. It's meant for smaller operations. And that's also why we get a lot of times into problems trying to get all the data from web API, because that's not the main use case for it. How does it work? Normally you have a client, which is a mobile device application or a website. In our case, the client will be Power BI using Power Query, and it's going to connect to a server using an HTTP request and response. And this request can be a GET or a POST. So normally you do a GET if you want to get some data, and we do a POST if you want to change something. As Power BI people, we just want to get the data, so we do a GET. And then we get a response, and hopefully it's a 200, that's a status code for it's okay. And then you get some data back. And this data can be in two formats. It can be either XML, that used to be in the 2000s, this is what the standard, but now we're moving away from XML because it's very verbose, and we're using JSON. And JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and this is basically the data structure for JavaScript. In the old days, we used to also have SOAP web services, but now it's more like RESTful web services. I'll explain you in a minute what this means. OData, that's a protocol on top of REST. So that means that you have a query string, and in the query string you can actually do queries like filtering and sorting and grouping and joining, really nice. And we also have authentication protocols like OAuth and API keys. We're also going to cover these. First things first, back in 2001, we had the concept of SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol. And this is what was the idea of creating business-to-business web services. It was an initiative developed by Microsoft and IBM, the big tech companies at the moment. It was very complex. It had a lot of features, transaction features, and it was very verbose. And this is how it looked like. You did like a post request. Even if you want to get some data, you still did a post. So that was a little bit strange. And then we have a SOAP envelope within the body. For example, I want to get the stock price for a ticker IBM. And then you would get a response from HTTP. And there you will get an envelope with the body, and there you would eventually find the price or the data that you wanted. So it was very complex. And you still see some web services using SOAP, and you can connect to them from Power BI, but this is not really a nice experience. But you could do it. Soon after SOAP, there came a new thing called REST, Representational State Transfer. It's a very simple concept, but it has a very difficult name. So what does it mean? Basically, the Rastafarians, the believers of REST, they said this SOAP is way too complicated. Let's go back to the basics of HTTP. Because HTTP already has operations like GET to get data, POST to send data, we have put, patch, and delete. So it's like a CRUD operation, so create, update, insert, and delete. And so we have all these things in the HTTP protocol. So why invent all these envelopes, all these strange things? And so that makes it way easier. So normally you do everything in the URL. We always do a get if you want to get some data. And we set everything, put everything in the URL. So here, stock IBM quote, that will be very easier. And sometimes you do things in a query string. You can do a lot of things there, like filtering. That's normally done in the query string. So for example, here I do a get for IBM quote. What do I get back? I get back XML or JSON. JSON is even more compact, so that's the favorite choice nowadays. And you just get the data that you want. You'll see most 99% of all the web servers, there will be REST nowadays, and most of them using JSON instead of XML. So let's take a look at it. HTTP request. So requests consist of a few things. We have the method. The get is to get data. The post, put, patch, delete are for the mutating things. We're not going to look into that. Then we have the protocol. That's always HTTP. We have the accept header. That's what kind of data that you expect to get back. I want JSON, XML, or HTML. The user agents, that's the client. Is it Power Query, or is it Excel, or is it a mobile device or website? In our case, it will be Microsoft Data Mashup. That's Power Query. And this is how a response would look like. We get the status code. So that's, is it okay or not? We get the server, some information on the server, not really that necessary to know. The content type, that's very important. Is it XML or JSON or HTML, for example? And then we get the body of the response, and that's the real XML or JSON. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to get in Power BI. These are some samples of status codes that you might encounter. Hopefully you get 200, but it can also be that the website has moved. So you get, for example, a 301, or maybe you get a bad request. So you did something wrong in the URL, or you're not authorized to access the data. That's also, of course, possible, or 404 if the URL is not existing anymore. But you can also get things like this, that you're being throttled. You do too many requests, for example. That's what Power BI people get a lot. They do a lot of requests to the web service, maybe using paging, and they do too many requests, and then the server says, no, stop. And sometimes you encounter some errors on the server side. Maybe you passed in some wrong query string parameters, or the server has an error, and you get the 500. Let's take a look at the demo. So here I have a REST API that's returning Formula 1 racing results. So in this case here I can specify in the URL the year I want the races from, 2021. If I switch it to 2022, you see the races from 2022. I'm not going to do this in a browser. I'm going to use a tool for that. Postman. Postman is a very easy tool to play the HTTP request and response and to really debug everything. So here I can say I want to get request with this URL, and here you can see the response in JSON. And here I can play around with the URL and I can change it. Now I want to do this, of course, in Power BI. So I tested URL, it's working. I'm going to copy it, and now I'm going to go over to Power Query. I'm going to do a new source, and I'm going to do a web query. Now I can just paste in the URL, click OK. There I have it. I have a table. OK. Let me refresh the preview. And there you see Formula 1 races 2022. I can open up the table. And here I can expand the table. Let's take all these columns. And now I can expand it even further. I want to see some circuit information. I don't need this one. I want to expand the location. So it's really easy to work with XML from Power Query. You can just expand all the nodes, and the same with JSON. It works exactly the same. And here you have all the columns that you need. Now, let's choose some columns. I'm not interested in all the columns. But this is just 2022. Of course, I also want to have it for different years. What I can do is I can change here the year into 2021. and then I have the races of 2021. What I would like to do is to call this web API for a list of years. So here I have created a list of years as a table. So here I just have a list of numbers. I'm going to convert it into text. And now what I want to do is I want to call this query for each year in this table. But to be able to call it, I need to convert it into a function. So I can go over to the advanced editor, and then here on top, I just have to add this. So 2 round brackets and then equal sign and greater than, and then between the round brackets I can set my input parameters. So for example, year as text. So this means the year parameter is of the type text. And then here what I could do is I could change this and then concatenate this year parameter. Okay? So now it's a function. So let's rename it f races. So let's insert year 2024. And there we have it. We have the races of 2024. So now what I can do is this function, I tested it. So now I go back to this years query, and here I can add a new column, invoke a custom function. I can select the function I just created, Formula 1 races. And now this year column, I'm going to insert this column 1. And that's also why it needed to be text, because the parameter is text, because I want to concatenate it to a query string. This can never be a number. And now, you see 2025, we have an error, because there are no races for 2025 apparently. And then let me remove this error for now. And then I can just expand all the columns. And there we have it. We have the races of all these different years combined. Let me show you a recap in the slides. One thing we need to change though, if you are going to mess around with this URL, just with the ampersand and then concatenating a year parameter, that doesn't work in the Power BI service. In the Power BI service, this URL, this base URL, should be stable, because that's like a connection string. You cannot change a connection string to a database dynamically. So this is not allowed. If you have some variants, you do it in the sub part. So this is like something that you need to add always. And in the sub part there, I can change the year. So if you put everything together, all the pieces, in the end, you will have like a function, the round brackets with input parameter year as text. Here you can also specify an output parameter. It will return the table. Then here we have the web.contents. That's the core function. And there we have the base URL with the relative part. And then the XML.tables, it will convert it into XML, and then you can add your own steps. Let's take a look at authentication. You can use anonymous, like we did in the previous demo, but yeah, for most cases, anonymous is not good enough. You can use Windows if you have on-premises web services, but normally it's on the internet, so you can use either basic, with username or password base64 encoded, or what is more common is that you use an API key. So you get an API key, for example, from Google, and then you can use that in your request. Or what is even more common is OAuth, and we look into that a little later. Then you have to get an access token, and with this access token you can do the call to the web API. Let's take a look at the API key. For example, I want to show you in the demo how to connect to the Google Distance API. So you can calculate the distance between two addresses, for example. This is a more complicated URL, and it's using a query string. So we have a base URL, that's this one, the distance matrix. And then we have a relative part, in this case just JSON or XML. And then we have the query string. And here we have some query strings parameters like origins, starting position, then we have the destination, and then we have the API key. And you can specify it here in query equals, and then we have this array, and there we have the different settings that you want to set, the query string parameters. And then we also can set some headers, for example, the accept, I want JSON back. We don't really need to do that in this case, because the relative part says JSON, so we get back JSON anyway. So if you would say accept XML, Google is not going to look into that. And then we have the content equals 0. That's meaning we're going to do a get. Okay, let's take a look at the demo how to work with this Google Distance API. The first thing you need to have is an API key. For that, I'll go over to the Google Developer Console, and there you can manage your own keys and credentials. In this case here, I create an API key for the distance matrix, and I can show you the key, I can copy it, and then this key I can use in my API calls. The first thing we're going to do again is go over to Postman, and here I'm going to build up my request. So here I have the base URL, JSON, and then the origins Amsterdam, destination Zagreb, and here we have the key. You can also see them here as separate parameters, square string parameters. I can do a request, and then you see I get back some JSON with some rows, and here I have the distance. So this is what I will need to call from Power BI. How do I do this? We're going to do a blank query in M code. And for that I created a template for you. So here in the folder I created a template for the previous example with the XML, but also one with a query string, an API key and JSON. That's a very common scenario. So here what I have is the full M code, and I'm just going to copy this M code and I'm going to walk you through. So then I go back to Power Query, and here I'm going to create a new query, and then I use a blank one. And then you go over to the advanced editor, and in this advanced editor, that's where you can paste your code. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paste my full URL here. So this is my full URL here. I'm going to copy the parts. So this is the URL, the base URL. And then I have a relative part. For example, that's a JSON. It's not really a relative part because it's not dynamic, but yeah, just for the sake of it, let's fill it in. And then we have the query string. So we have the origin equals Amsterdam. And then we have the other parameter, that's the destination. And then we have the key. Key equals, and then the value. Okay, let's take a look if it works. There we have it. We have the rows, and in these rows we have a record, and in this record we have elements list. There we have again a record, and there we can find the distance. I'm interested in the distance. There we have it. This is like in meters, and this is in kilometers. Let's take this one. If you right click on it, you can say drill down, and then you just get this value. So now we have a query that's just going to return a value. So this is perfect. But now, of course, I want to make it dynamic again. So let's go back to the advanced editor, because all these things, of course, they should be dynamic. So that's why we're going to turn it into a function again. So now I'm going to add the round brackets, equal sign, and the greater than. And here, now I have a few parameters. We have the source, the origin, as text. We have the destinations as text, and we also have the API key, but let's leave it for now. So here we should have then the origins, and then we have the destinations. Okay, so let's go back. I had a type destinations like this. Okay. So now we get two parameters. I can fill in Amsterdam and, for example, Utrecht. Let's invoke. And there I have the distance in meters. So it's 44 kilometers. So that works. Of course, the API key, normally you make a parameter in Power Query and use that parameter instead of having the key hard-coded, but for now it's fine. So now I have a function that has input parameters origins and destination, and the output is the number of kilometers between these two addresses. Let's rename it into a nice function name, f distance. And now I can call this function again. Here I have some data with some trips with some origin and destinations, and now I can add a new column using the invoke function. And here I can select my function, and I can just fill in the column names. Origin, origin, destination, destinations. And there we have it. We have the distances. The next topic we're going to look into is OData. OData means that you can query a web API using the query string. So for example, you can pass here behind the question mark a $filter, specifying some filter criteria like category ID equals 435. You can also use an order by to sort on specific columns. You can even select specific columns that you want to see. And you can do some things with paging. Let's first start with the filter. So here again I have Postman. So here I can enter the $filter. I can click on send, and then it's gonna get only the orders for customer ID Auth key, as you can see. I can also specify an order by. I want to order on the order date descending, and I only want to select the order ID and the order date. And if I execute it, you can see I only get the order ID and the order date, and it's ordered descending. If you look at the $filter, that's the one that you use quite often. What kind of things can you use here? For example, I can also say order date is greater than GT, a date time, and then here you specify a date and optionally a time. Here the slides are also edited, so here you can see what it means: equal, non-equal, greater than, less than. You also have an and an or, and if you're working with date times, you need to specify date times in front of it. Another scenario for using these operators is when you want to do paging. Normally, if you connect to a web API, you cannot get all the data. For example, here I get filter customer ID equals Auth key, but what if I don't add a filter? Then you get all the orders, and this could potentially be 100,000 of orders or more, and most web APIs don't allow you to get all the data. So what you need to add is, like, I want to get a certain amount of records. For that you can use the $top. $top means I get 100 rows or 1,000 rows or 10,000 rows. And you can also skip some rows. And a lot of times the API is limited what you can get per request. So it's like 1,000 or 10,000, but generally it's not like millions of rows. So that's why you need to do paging. The first thing you need to do if you want to get all the data using paging is you need to know how many rows are there in total. For that we can use the $inline count. It will give you the total number of rows with the filter in mind. So if you add the $filter and inline count, you only get the filtered rows count. So here you can see how this works. I can do a $inline count equals all pages. Let's remove this top is 0 for now. So now it's going to get you all the orders, and at the same time you get the count. How many orders are there in total? You see it here, OData count 17,000. So we have 17,000 rows in total, but I don't need the orders themselves. So now it's going to give me the count and the orders. So that's why you have to add the $top equals 0, because I'm not interested in the orders themselves. I want to get them paginated. How do you get orders paginated? So I can remove this one. I can say I want the top 1,000 and $skip equals, maybe I want to skip 1,000. So now you get basically the second page. And I can say I want to skip another 1,000 and you get page 3. And like this you can get all the pages. But how do we do this? It's rather complicated to do all these things, so that's why I created a template for you. You can find the template in the files again. Let's open it up. So here we have the steps. The first thing we need to determine what is the page size. That depends on the web API. Normally it's something like 1,000 or 10,000. So we need to create a parameter for that in Power Query. Here we have the parameter. I created it using manage parameters. I set it to 100. Let's make it a little bit bigger, 1,000. Then we go to the second part. I'm going to create a blank query. I'm just going to paste in this code. What is this going to do? It's going to give you a function that executes this inline count all pages with a top is 0. So it's just going to return one number, the total number of rows. So here I'm going to create a new blank query. And I'm just going to paste in the code. So this is already put in there the URL, but normally you have to put in there the URL. I'm going to get the orders. Everything looks fine. And this one I'm going to give a name. Function count rows. This will be the name. And if I execute it, to give an error message, it's this one. You cannot have numbers here, should always be a string. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, now I get the number, that's fine. So that's the first step. Let's go to the second step. So now what we're going to do is create a query that's going to give me the data for one specific data page. I'm going to add a new blank query. Via the advanced editor, I'm going to paste the code. Let's take a look at the code. So first we have an input parameter, that's the page number. Then it's going to calculate what the skip should be. So it's multiplying it times the page size. And then it's going to get the same URL. It's going to use the top and get the page size. It should be a text because it cannot be a number. The query string is always string. And then it's going to fill in the skip. And then it's going to get the data. But here, of course, we need to add some extra steps that we want to do with the data. So in this case, it's not fully ready yet. Let's first test it out. So I'm going to enter a page like 2. I'm going to invoke. And then you'll get a list. So it's working. I can click on the list. And here you see the records. I have to convert it to a table. And then I can do my things. I can expand the data. But of course, this is all what I want to do inside the function. But the downside of a function is, if you go over to the advanced editor, it's difficult to read and I don't want to do too much things here. So what I did before, I just created a normal query. So what happens here, this is just the same API without a query string. I'm just going to get all the data. And now I can do my steps. I can click on this. I want to convert it into a table. I'm going to expand all these records. Looking good. Now I can do all my things. I can set the data types. For now, I'm not going to bother, but normally you have to do all these different things. And these steps, I want to add them to the function. It's easier to do it here because here you have the user interface and it's just like a test query. So now I can go over to my advanced editor. And what do I need? This is the JSON. So let's copy from the JSON. It's going to take the value. Let's take this whole thing. I'm going to copy this code. I'm going over to the query that we have here. And here I'm going to paste it. And you see the JSON you already have, so we can remove it. You see it perfectly fits the function that I created. And here I have to add a column. And the expanded column, that's return, so it's going to do its thing for the page number, and a nicely formatted table should be returned. So now if I executed page 2, you see now you have a better result. Let's give this a more meaningful name. I'm going to take this as a name for now. Okay, so now we have a function that can get the total number of rows. We have a function that can get for a specific page the data. So now we need to have a third query that connects everything together. And that's this one. So I'm going to take the all data. Again, is a blank query. So here you see how it works. The first step is going to call the function row count. We get the number of rows. Then we're going to do a roundup. And then here it's going to generate a list for the number of pages. So the row count is divided by the page size. So in this case, 17,000 is divided by 1,000. We have 17 pages, but we're going to do it 18 times because we have a little bit more than 17. So here we generate a list from 1 to 18. And then we're going to convert it into a list. And then we're going to execute the function again. So this is what you did before also, but this is an M code, add column, and here it's going to execute the function with the page number as an input parameter. Let's see what happens. It's going to refer to function get orders page X. I called it here get data page X, so let's rename this one. And then it should execute the web API 18 times. And now you will see here page 1, page 2, page 3, all the orders we are getting paginated 18 times. And then if you expand this one, then we get the total of all these different rows. If you check here with the column profile, how much do we have? 17,076 rows in total. Okay, we've seen now how to get data from Web API using paging. Is this the most efficient way? Not always, because if you have like 1 million rows and you're going to do all these pages and all these calls every day, every time that you refresh the model, that's not the best way to do it. It can take quite a long time, especially if you're getting lots of tables from lots of APIs. What is a better way? To only get the data that has been changed. And that is what you can do with incremental refresh. You only need two things in Power Query. You need two parameters, one range start, one range end of date time type. They should exactly be named like this. And these two parameters, these you need to use in your Power Query. You can use it with SQL queries, with REST APIs. It doesn't matter what your Power Query does, but you have to use the range start and range end. For example, here I can use OData to filter. So I convert the range start and range end to text using a specific format. This was the format that you need. Then I'm going to use the OData filter, order date greater or equal to date time and less than date time. And here I can then add the formatted range end and range start. And then I'm going to use it as a $filter query string parameter. And then you only get the data from that date range. This is not the only thing you need to do, of course. After you created these two parameters, what you need to do is go over, right click on your table in Power BI, you click on Incremental Refresh, and then here you can enable it and you can say, okay, what do you want to store? So this is the total of data that Power BI will store. So say 5 years or 10 years. Everything that is older than that will be removed automatically from your data set. But you can also take like a very big range. But the most important part is this one. What do you want to refresh? So this determines the range start and range end. So what it will do underneath, it will create some partitions. For example, it will create partitions per year and per month and per day. And especially for the latest periods, the current periods, it will create day partitions. And in this case, it will throw away the last 10 day partitions and then reload them again using a new range start and a range end. And that's basically everything you need to do. And then everything works automatically. In the Power BI desktop, you'll only load what in your range start and range end is specified as just manual data, as hard-coded data. And then if you publish to the Power BI servers, then the incremental refresh will work. The last topic we're going to cover is OAuth. OAuth is a way of authenticating and getting data from a web API that has user data. What do I mean by user data? For example, Facebook, a user enters some data. Or LinkedIn, a user enters some data. Or in SalesForce, a salesperson enters some data. And as a BI developer with Power BI, I want to get this data. But I'm not the user. It's not my data. I'm just responsible of getting the data and bringing it into a report. So if you look at the OAuth flow, there are a few flows. For example, you have the authorization code flow. That's what you use if you have like a web application or mobile app and you want to get the data. There are three actors. We have the user itself. That's called the resource owner. It's his data. He entered the data. Then we have the client. The client is again, in this case, Power Query or a mobile app or a website that needs the data. But it's not the same as the user. It's a different entity. And especially when you're using Power Query, it's like doing it in the backend every day, for example. There's no user involved. As a client, you want to connect to the server, and that's what I call the resource server. And this server has the web API. If you want to get data using OAuth, you need first an access token. And with the access token, you can do the call. How you get the access token? That's where we have an authorization endpoint and a token endpoint. First, you need to get an authorization code. That's why it's called authorization code flow. And the authorization code, that's where the user is involved. So you get a call, you do a call to this authorization endpoint, then it's being redirected to a new page. Then the user, the resource owner, needs to approve this. Okay, this client wants to use my data. Do I agree with that or not? And then if the resource owner agrees with that, he approves it, then you get an authorization code. And then with this authorization code, you can get to the token endpoint, and there you can get your access token. And then this access token you can send to the web API. It's a lot of things, a lot of components. And in Power Query, it doesn't work. So that's a bummer. Huh? So if you're using the authorization code, if you have to use that one, you cannot call this web API from Power Query, because we cannot reach out to the user, because we're running at the backend in the Power BI servers. There's no user involved. So there's also no user that can approve it. So this is a no-go. But most OAuth web APIs also have a client credentials flow. Client means Power Query. Client means the app, not a real user. It's a client-server scenario. So what does it mean? I can just go to the token endpoint. I can do a GET request normally, or a POST with the client ID and a secret and a scope. Scope means what you want to get, which tables that you basically need. This is like a username and a password, you could say, a client ID and secret. You have to get it, and it needs to be secure. And then you get an access token back, and this access token you can send to the web API. This is a flow that you can use and do from Power Query. How would it look like code-wise? So what we do is we connect to this token endpoint, for example in Azure, this is the URL. And then here in the body, normally we convert this to binary. We have a grant type client credentials, that's a flow. We have a client ID and a secret, and then we have the scope. And then what you get back is a JSON document, and embedded in there is the JSON token. It's called access token normally, but this depends on the web API. OAuth is a standard, but everybody implements it slightly different. And then what you need to do, and that's most often the same, you do a GET request in this case to, for example, orders. And then in a header, we add the authorization header. And there we have the text bearer, space, and then the access token. This is in all OAuth web APIs the same, this part. And then of course, here you can also add a query string with exactly the things that you want. And then you get the data back and everything just works. In the slides, I added also some reference calls. Maybe you have like some form data that you want to do and do a post. Sometimes you have to really fill in a form in the website and then click on the submit button. That's what I call a post. And then you get some data back. For example, in this case, I get some JSON data back if I post some parameters. And I also added a slide for a SOAP request. Maybe you have, you're out of luck. You have a SOAP web service you need to connect to. It's of course possible. Then you have to have a body with all the SOAP envelope and the body and everything that you need to pass in. And then you get back the response. With that, we have come to the end of this presentation. Hopefully you found it useful. You can find all the examples and the PowerPoint slides in this URL. And if you have some questions, please reach out to me via email or LinkedIn. Have a great day.